Hello, and welcome to our second life sciences lesson on the history of the Earth. What we're going to do today is we're going to be looking at something called the Cambrian explosion, which actually doesn't have anything to do with bombs exploding. The map for the lesson is part of the map for the section. So if we look at the map for the section, we looked at fossils, we looked at the timeline of the history of the Earth, and we're now going to be looking at the Cambrian explosion, which is how the wide variety of Earth, or the wide variety of animals on Earth, came into being. In the Cambrian explosion, we're going to be looking at a geological timescale, which tells us when different animals existed on Earth and what their fossils looked like. Then we're going to look at how is this timeline, which is 550 million years, so it's quite a long time. How do we divide it up? It's divided up into eras and periods. And then we're going to have a look at the ages of the Earth. Some of the weird and wonderful fossils of animals that did once exist on Earth, even though sometimes when you look at it, it's hard to believe. We start off with revising how does fossilization occur. This is the same picture as in the last lesson. The animal first has to die, soft parts decay, and the skeleton remains, and the skeleton is covered in sediment. Then layer upon layer of sediment is laid down over the skeleton. Groundwater comes through with minerals in it, and the minerals go into the skeleton, and gradually, over millions of years, what was bone turns into stone. Depending on what happens on the surface of the Earth, sometimes erosion occurs, and eventually our fossil is exposed so that we can actually see what the fossil looks like, and the paleontologists can get to working out what does it come from, where did it live, things like that. The next thing is, do all animals fossilize? And the answer is no. Anything with a soft body doesn't fossilize very well. However, we do have some fossils of soft-bodied organisms, but that has to happen. The animal has to die, it's got to be buried immediately after death, and it's got to be buried in an environment where there is no oxygen so that it doesn't decay. And that is why fossils of soft-bodied animals are very, very rare, but there are some. So we do have an idea of what some of the soft-bodied organisms looked like. The next one, animals with exoskeletons like your insects, your arthropods, your crabs, things like that, they fossilize very well because they have got a hard exoskeleton. And as we know from the previous lesson, anything hard fossilizes very well. Then, if we start looking at animals with endoskeletons, skeletons inside their body, the bones fossilize, but the soft parts of the body generally don't. So scientists have to look at the bones and then work out from the bones what they think the animal looked like. That is a picture of an actual dinosaur fossil bone. It's quite amazing, isn't it? How large it is compared to the people who are working alongside. So, the people who look at fossils are called paleontologists. And from a fossil bone like this, it's amazing what they can work out. They can work out what an organism looked like, how they moved, and in some cases, what they ate and how they behaved. And all the models of extinct animals that we look at, because of course extinct, they don't exist today. So how do scientists know what they look like? They have worked out, they know from looking at the fossil and working out what the animal must have looked like. So all the pictures you see are derived from fossil evidence. Okay, let's have a look. This is how they work. Okay, they find a fossil of this rather nice dinosaur. Okay, and they put it together. And people who deal with fossils will know how the vertebrae fit together, things like that. So they can put together a skeleton of a dinosaur. Then other experts come in. And they have a look at the skeleton and they know all about muscles. And they will work out to hold up a head with a long neck like that, the animal needs neck muscles that are rather strong. To be able to lift those very, very heavy legs, the animal will need quite strong muscles in its legs. It'll need quite strong muscles in its thighs. So they base the shape of the animal on what they know about animals that exist today and what would be needed to make those bones of the dinosaur move. Then they take and they use their imagination and they take into account the environment in which the animal lived. And that is how they decide what colors to make the animal and what the texture of the animal's skin is like. That is all based on what the paleontologists think, whereas the shape of the animal is based on scientific fact. So it's pretty close to what the animal would have looked like, even though the color of the animal and the texture of its skin could be somewhat different to what the scientists think it is. Now, let's start our look at what happened in the Cambrian explosion with revising what we looked at in a previous lesson to do with the timeline of the Earth. So, let's have a look. This is our timeline, starting with when the Earth was formed 4,600 million years ago. Life started about here, and for all the way up to here, life was very simple, small, microscopic, not very complicated at all, until we got to 550 million years ago, when suddenly in geological time, which is over 10 million years or so, there were huge varieties of different animals, diverse animals, which suddenly appeared in the fossil record. And this rapid expansion of the variety of life was called the Cambrian explosion. And here are some of the organisms that existed, but remember this is an artist's impression, because anything soft like these tentacles would not have fossilized well. But because they know that these mollusks were similar to octopus, they look at what an octopus looks like and they work out what that animal's head and body would have actually looked like. So we are looking at this huge variety of life called the Cambrian explosion. At the start of the Cambrian explosion, animals were simple. Even though they were multicellular, they didn't have very complex organs inside them. As time went by, the animals became larger, they developed complex tissues inside them, and they became a weird and wonderful array of living things, and we're going to be having a look at some of them later on in this lesson. Now, if we look at this, this is a timeline, and this is 550 million years ago, which is when the Cambrian explosion started. Up till then, all of the animals or all of the organisms were either prokaryotic, unicellular, or they were eukaryotic, unicellular, and sometimes simple multicellular organisms. But during the Cambrian explosion, as you can see, all of these different forms of life, for example, crabs, snails, lizards, starfish, all of those had their origin at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. Even though what existed in the early Cambrian is slightly different in form to what we see today, the basic groups came into being. Now, this is called a geological timescale. Now, I know it's got a hang of a lot in it, and it's quite a lot to take in. But basically what this sets up is it shows that from 550 million years ago, which is here, it shows the changes in living organisms as time went by. The time before the Cambrian explosion is called the pre-Cambrian era, and that's all those 4,550 million years that we looked at in the previous lesson. And what we're looking at now is what happened after that. And there are three main eras: the Paleozoic era, which is your very primitive animals, your Mesozoic, which is when dinosaurs ruled the earth, and the Cenozoic eras, which is the last 60 or so million years. And if we look, we can see pictures. These pictures show some of the common types of living things which existed at the time. And as you can see from the Cambrian period to now, the living things are very, very different. And what we're going to look at is how life changed as time went by. I don't want you to get your minds all muddled up, so I think we need to take a break. Welcome back from your break. Before the break, we looked at the history of the Earth via the geological timescale. What we're going to be looking at now is how do we divide up the geological timescale, and that is we divide it into eras and periods, and that's what we're going to have a look at now. This is the geological timescale with the different eras, the three main eras. Now, as you can see, each of these main eras is divided up into smaller and smaller portions, which we call periods, and they all last more or less 50 million years. Because there's so much on this slide, we're going to look just at the Paleozoic period, and we are going to have a look at the different periods in that Paleozoic time. So here we have just the information from the Paleozoic era, and we can see it's divided up into 6 periods. And those periods are more or less 50 million years. But the interesting thing is the pictures next to each period show some of the common animals which existed at that particular time on Earth. The ones that are shown here are the most common fossils that were found at that particular time, and they are called index fossils. They are the common animals that show if you find a piece of rock and it's got that fossil in it, you know that it came from that particular time in the history of the Earth. What this also gives us is it shows when these particular periods existed. And you have to be able to look at a scale like this and say, okay, if this is the Devonian period, you will need to read off, this is how long the Devonian period actually existed. So you have to be able to interpret something like this. And here we're looking at the next one, which is the Mesozoic era, and it is divided into 3 periods. Now, the Mesozoic era was when dinosaurs ruled the earth. And have a look at this. The Jurassic period is when dinosaurs ruled the earth. Can you think of a movie which has dinosaurs in it? Jurassic Park. And again, all the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park are actually based on what scientists have worked out that dinosaurs actually looked like when they existed on Earth. The only thing, remember, we don't know what color they were. Now, this is another representation of the geological timescale, and it's really, really quite a lot to take in. But the good news is you don't have to learn this. But what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to extract information given to you in a geological timescale. So you have to be able to use something like this to find information. For example, over what time period did the Devonian period extend? So you would go here and you would find the Devonian period and you would see how long did it last, 60 million years. And if we look at what this is, that will be which index fossils or which animals were common at that particular time. Here we have another geological timescale, also with the pictures of the animals that were very, very common at that particular time. And you also need to be able to link the period or the era, the period, when that period was and which animals are found in that particular period. So you need to be able to link all these different parts together. For example, this again is the Paleozoic era, which we have enlarged. And here is an example of a question: when were invertebrates the most common form of life? So you look at the pictures here and you say, okay, there are some things that look like fish, but hey, all of these at the bottom here, they are all invertebrates. So over which time were invertebrates the most common form of life? From 570 to 430 million years ago. Which era was it? Paleozoic era. And which periods? Sorry about that. Which periods? The Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian periods. You don't need to remember these names, you just need to be able to use a geological timescale and extract the information from it. Then, from fossils, paleontologists have discovered the most amazing animals that existed on Earth. Did you know that 99% of all the animals and plants that existed on Earth are extinct? And we only know what they look like because paleontologists have found fossils of them and worked out what these animals actually looked like. So, while most of these are now extinct, we know what they look like. And what we're going to be looking at next is we're going to be looking at the history of the Earth, but we're dividing it into different ages depending on the type of organisms that were most common at the time. And that's what we're going to be looking at next, the ages of the Earth. Early on in geological time, invertebrates ruled the Earth, and invertebrates that are very, very different to the invertebrates that we have today. So let's look at some of them. Very strange. This is an artist's representation of what some of these animals look like. But remember, this is all based on fossil evidence. At the beginning of the Cambrian explosion, which is that time span, oh, and you don't need to know those times, because if you're asked to interpret a geological time scale, those million years would be on the time scale. Most of the Earth was sea, and there were lots and lots of invertebrates. Seas were warm. Land was barren. Living things couldn't grow on land. Sea levels were high. At one stage, 300 meters higher than the sea levels today. Some common invertebrates, monster shrimps, 1 meter in size. They were fierce predators. This picture is a model made from fossil evidence. Another animal common at the time was something called a trilobite, and this was an arthropod, and this is an actual fossil of a trilobite, and they were very, very common back in the Cambrian period, and they're basically related to lobsters and crabs. Next period was the Ordovician period, which lasted for 45 million years, and during this time, invertebrate life continued to diversify. Seas were warm, sea levels were high. It was a lovely environment, so animals could survive quite easily. Another picture of some of the animals that existed at that particular time. Remember, this is an artist's representation. If we look at most of these, don't exist anymore. The only one which still exists in more or less the same form is this one, okay? And that is called a nautilus. And nautiluses do exist nowadays, even though they're very, very rare. The rest of these, we only know they existed because of their fossils. And here are two common, well, this is one common fossil animal, which makes up about 90% of the fossils found in these layers of rocks. They were ammonites. That's what they look like from the outside. And this is what they look like from the inside if you cut them open. And as you can see, they were made of a whole lot of compartments. Now, the beautiful colors shown here do exist, but they are from the minerals that percolated into this as it became a fossil. And these were related to the octopus. Welcome back from your break. We are going to carry on looking at the different ages of the earth. And remember, an age of the earth refers to which particular type of animal was dominant on earth during that particular time. So, we're looking at the ages of the earth, and that is linked to the geological time scale. Early on in the Paleozoic era, invertebrates ruled the earth. Very unusual and weird type of invertebrates like we've never seen before, but we know they existed because we have fossil evidence to prove it. Okay, next is the Silurian period, which started 440 million years ago. Most life was still in the sea, and we can see here the Nautilus, which we've seen before, and some very weird-looking organisms which don't exist anymore. But in this period, living things moved onto land. So terrestrial ecosystems became established. And this is a picture of an artist representation of what the landscape looked like. The green plants at the bottom were mosses, and these things that look like trees, they were giant fungi, which were as big as trees. Weird, eh? Next came the Devonian period, and that was when vertebrate animals started taking over. And in the Devonian period, it's sometimes called the Age of Fish. That's the time span that it lasted, and the interesting things were giant fish. And some of them were fierce predators, up to 6 meters long. On land, plants were now able to grow on land because they now had developed vascular tissue such as xylem and phloem, which you've probably heard of before. That enabled them to survive on dry land. Forests spread across the continent, but if we have a look, these trees and plants are not ones that we recognize because they don't exist anymore. Then, important, 4-legged animals started being able to walk on land, and they were the ancestors of the land animals that we have today. The next period was the most prolific period in prehistoric life, the Carboniferous period. It was warm, there was no ice. Lush forests spread across the land. Living things diversified to form a huge variety of different plants and animals. So it's the Carboniferous period, 360 to 290 million years ago. Warm temperatures, lush rainforests, and because the rainforests were lush, they pumped oxygen into the atmosphere. So the oxygen level rose up to about 35% of the atmosphere. Amphibians, which previously lived in the sea or in lakes, could now move onto land, and there's a picture of an amphibian, which is now, because of it has legs, fins have developed into legs, so the amphibians can now move onto land. If you have a look, you can see there that amphibian has got fins at the tip, but it's got the start of little legs. So if that animal went onto land, it would be able to move around, albeit quite slowly. Also during the Carboniferous period, because the oxygen levels were so high, your arthropods grew to huge sizes. You can see all the lush tropical forests, but that's a dragonfly. And its wingspan was 1 meter across. This is a type of millipede, but just look at it. They found fossils of this, and they then used it to make a model. Okay, this is an actual fossil. This shows how big they were compared to humans, and this shows some paleontologists who have just made a model of this giant millipede. But the insects could only become large because the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere was extremely high. Another thing that happened in the Carboniferous period was at the end of the Carboniferous period, temperatures dropped. So the rainforests died. And as these rainforests died, so if we have a look, here is the rainforest, the swampy forest. The trees died because it got cold. They decomposed. And eventually, after millions of years, they formed coal. So all the coal beds that are mined in South Africa originate from the lush forests during the Carboniferous period. After the Carboniferous period was the Permian period, which lasted 40 million years ago. And in this, the sea levels dropped, jungles covered the land, but oxygen levels dropped. So those big insects couldn't survive anymore, so they died out. Land animals became increasingly diversified. And if you look here, that is a rather weird creature called a dimetrodon, which existed at that particular time. Then some of these giant organisms arose. This looks like a reptile, but it's actually an amphibian. And as you can see, check his teeth. He was a rather ferocious predator. At the end of this period, though, there was a huge mass extinction, and most of the animals that had existed in those lush forests died out. Before your minds get muddled, let's take an ad break. See you later. Welcome back from your ad break. We're going to carry on looking at the ages of the Earth, which is looking at a period in geological time when different types of animals actually dominated or ruled the Earth. Next era we're looking at is the Mesozoic era, which is divided into 3 periods, and all 3 of these periods are considered the age of reptiles. First period is the Triassic period, which lasted 50 million years, and conditions then were hot and dry with low levels of oxygen. Animals which could thrive in this dry environment, reptiles. So a variety of reptiles developed, including the first small dinosaur. Okay, and here he is, the size of a dog. But his relatives were soon to take over the earth. Next is the well-known Jurassic period. And in the Jurassic period, which lasted more or less 50 million years, dinosaurs ruled the earth. A huge variety of different types of dinosaurs developed, and I'm sure from this picture you recognize some of them. You might even have had some of these as plastic toys when you were little. If we look at that one, I'm sure everybody knows what that is. That is a T-Rex. This one here, absolutely huge. That's the Diplodocus, biggest dinosaur. And if you have a look, here's a model of a Diplodocus, and it reached up to 35 meters in length. They were huge. But interestingly enough, they were herbivores, so they weren't fearsome at all. Also in this period, lots of different looking dinosaurs developed, and we know quite a lot about them because many complete fossil dinosaurs of different types have been found, and as you can see in the picture, the bones have all been excavated and they've been put together in museums, and this just gives you an indication of how large those dinosaurs were. The last of the Mesozoic periods in the age of the reptiles was the Cretaceous period. And dinosaurs still ruled the earth, but the most ferocious is the Tyrannosaurus rex, which is 12 meters long. And it had 60 serrated teeth, and each tooth was about 25 centimeters long. That's more or less the length of a ruler. And as you can see, they were pretty sharp because these were ferocious predators. Many skeletons of Tyrannosaurus rex have been found, and I've just put in this picture just to give you an idea. If you look at the tables and things in the background, it gives you an idea of how huge they were and how deadly their teeth must have been. Now, also in the Cretaceous period, a tiny little mammal developed. Okay, and it was basically about the size of a rat. And of course, because dinosaurs were huge, these little rat-like creatures managed to hide away and survive without being affected by these predaceous dinosaurs. Also in the Cretaceous period, a small dinosaur called Archaeopteryx occurred, and it actually had wings and feathers. And we know that it actually had feathers because they have found good fossils showing that even though its body was more like a dinosaur, it had wings and feathers. And this indicates, which scientists now believe, that birds evolved from dinosaurs. In fact, dinosaurs are more similar to birds than they are to the other reptiles that exist today. At the end of the Cretaceous period, there was a mass extinction, and it killed off all the dinosaurs and many other species. And we'll have a look at a later lesson what could actually have caused this to happen. But scientists know that it did happen, and all those extremely large dinosaurs did not exist after that extinction event. We then moved into the Cenozoic era. That's from 65 million years ago, and that is called the Age of Mammals. Only small animals survived the mass extinction, and because all the dinosaurs were now dead, there were lots of empty habitats. So they diversified to fill the empty habitats. And that led to the development of an amazing variety of different types of mammals. This diagram shows artists' impressions of what some of those mammals looked like. Remember, this isn't the artist's imagination, it's based on fossils that have actually been found and worked on by scientists. Then, even though it's called the Age of Mammals, birds also evolved. And a good example is this 2-meter large bird, and it was termed the terror bird because it was such a vicious predator. Throughout the continents, different mammal groups developed, and most of those mammals were marsupials, which means they feed their babies milk, but the baby develops in the pouch and not inside the body. Some of them looked a bit like primitive types of horses. Then we also find the largest land mammal ever, 3 times as big as an elephant. And they didn't have to worry because nothing much ever tried to eat them. In the Cenozoic period, we also find that some mammals return to the water. And this is as an example of a fossil which has been found, and they call it the walking whale. And they reckon that animals like this were the ancestors of the whales and dolphins which we find on the earth today. Another very interesting one is called the hell pig. And from shoulder to floor, it was 1.8 meters, the size of a grown man. And just look at those teeth. Okay, no wonder they called it a hell pig. It was a vicious predator, but interestingly enough, though it looks like a pig, it's not related to the pigs which occur today. Then, I'm sure you're familiar with this. If you've ever watched the Ice Age movies, here we have mammoths. Okay, and the mammoths thrived closer towards the end of the Cenozoic period because at that stage, you can see in the background, there was a period of global cooling. Throughout the Cenozoic periods, there were several ice ages for 10 million years, then it warmed up again, then the habitats became more tropical, then there was another ice age. And what this did is it produced many different habitats so that animals can become adapted to the many different habitats. And scientists believe that this is one of the reasons that there are so many different mammals and so many different living organisms on the earth today because of the variety of different habitats. Also, towards the end of the Cenozoic era, in the last 4 million years, saw the rise of hominids. Okay, now hominids are primitive humans. If you've ever been to Marapeng or Sterkfontein caves, you will have learned about hominids or primitive or early humans. And they started arising about 4 million years ago. Then, 200,000 years ago, modern humans arose. And ever since then, we have become the dominant animal on Earth. And one of the reasons is, even though we don't have sharp teeth, and even though we don't have big muscles, we have a brain. And we could use the brain to help small family groups, like in this one, to survive. I hope you have found this little peek into the ages of the earth interesting, and I sincerely hope it helps your understanding of the history of life. See you next time.